to a number of models of ODR within the justice system. And it models the idea that ODR is either an autonomous procedure to be adopted or a procedural structure to be adequate to the conventional procedure we experience. What do I mean by that? When we talk about ODR, some make a distinction between ODR as a private environment and digital justice or online courts as a public environment. I think this division is not entirely right because in the end, what we are thinking about is how to promote the aggregation of this technology to the dispute resolution system, and we can do this in an autonomous procedure, or we can do it by making a procedural adequacy for technology. And the example that is perhaps closest to all of us in Brazil is exactly the tendency that has now begun to be inaugurated, both in the TJDFT and in the TRF1, around the technical coupling of consumer.gov.br as an inaugural stage of the procedure of the PJE in these courts. Which basically means what? There is a whole debate, and you should follow this, about the obligation of prior submission to mechanisms of generation of resisted pretension, which can be in an ODR, it can be in an ODR, it can be whatever. And the tendency in the consumer market is to force the citizen to submit to consumer.gov.br. What I particularly find an error in this debate is first, because I find it absolutely unnecessary. Because the idea of this being lacking or not having the interest to act, it completely loses its importance as you combine consumer.gov.br with PGE. In other words, the person, the lawyer, will propose something in PGE, automatically it falls into consumer.gov. If he doesn't resolve it in the temporal lapse of consumer.gov, he goes back to the procedure. There is no need to create this gymnastics that the procedural doctrine has been doing to create theses around this, because this, for me, is not functional and creates a very serious problem for people who do not have digital citizenship. In other words, for those people who are not affected or do not have adequate equipment and connection, and we cannot fail to realize that we live in a country with a very brutal inequality, and there are people who, even having connection and equipment, do not know how to use technology. All of you must have someone in the family who has even a page on social media but does not know how to send an email. And sometimes it is not because of a lack of economic conditions, it is because the person did not have a digital literacy. But this chapter of the ADR, then, is coupled with the multi-port model, allowing the creation of procedural structures, even in the private sphere, to dimension conflicts in a customized way, and so on. This started with low-complexity litigation, but today it is perfectly possible to customize with technology in conflicts of very high complexity. And we have an emblematic example here in Brazil, which is the case of the judicial recovery of the OI. They created an infrastructure entity linked to an ADR in which they were able to make 60,000 agreements using an electronic platform and were able to dimension a problem that would have led to the bankruptcy of the Court of Justice of Rio de Janeiro. So, the ADR becomes a chapter that you can, as I have already said, treat it as a side of the justice system, or you can link it to the Brazilian judiciary's tendency through a tendency that needs to be properly studied. Fred, in fact, has just published a book on this, which is the role of infranormativity in Brazil. It is the role, for example, of the CNJ resolutions and of this entire chapter, and within these CNJ resolutions there is the 358 resolution which deals with the ADRs linked to the judiciary. So we walk towards this, but we have a problem.